Right, today we're talking about dualism and materialism. This is just the first part of our discussion of dualism and materialism. In this video, I'll talk about different kinds of dualism and then arguments against dualism. In the next video, I'll talk about arguments for dualism. So our reading for this week is by Paul Churchland. Churchland, I know this is a difficult reading and it's long and dense. It's actually the most concise and precise presentation of kind of contemporary discussion that I think you could probably get. So there's a lot packed in there, but it's very helpful stuff. Churchland and his wife, Patricia Churchland, are philosophical collaborators. He's now retired from UC San Diego. And our reading is an excerpt from his book, Matter and Consciousness. Now, Churchland himself defends a kind of materialism. The Churchlands defend the most radical kind of materialism, eliminative materialism. Now, I don't think we'll be discussing that view per se, but just so you know, their basic idea is that only physical material things exist, but furthermore, all of our talk about mental phenomena, like beliefs and desires and emotions and so forth, that's really all just kind of folk psychology, and a really good science of the mind will eliminate all mental language. But really none of that stuff exists. All it is brain states. And the true description of the world wouldn't even talk about mental stuff. It would just talk about brain chemistry. Anyway, that's okay if you didn't quite catch all that. Let's talk about terminology first. Materialism versus dualism. So I'm going to use the word materialism interchangeably with physicalism. And this view says this: there's only one kind of substance in the world, and that's physical matter. And there's only one kind of properties in the world, and that is physical properties. The only kind of things there are physical material things. The only kind of qualities or properties that they have are physical properties, material properties. Now, dualism is the view that says, as the name indicates, there are at least two kinds of things in the world. There is material, physical stuff, but there's also non-material, non-physical stuff. So the view is that the essential nature of conscious intelligence resides in something non-physical, in something forever beyond the scope of sciences like physics, neurophysiology, and computer science. All right, so let me step back and clarify. A materialist says, what is your mind? Your mind is just your physical brain. There's nothing except your physical brain. All the mental stuff is just ultimately physical stuff. The dualist says, wait a second, in addition to your physical brain, there's also a non-physical component to you. The mind, or if you want to call it the soul, you can. The mind or the soul is non-physical. It's a kind of spirit or something like that. So materialists or physicalists are kind of hard-nosed, naturalistic types who say, look, all that there is in the world is stuff that science can get at. And the dualist says, no, there's more than that. There's also, the mind is something non-physical. It's like a soul or a spirit or something like that. It can't be reduced to just atoms and chemistry and brains. So Churchland is a materialist, a hard-nosed materialist. And he's arguing against dualism. There's different kinds of dualism, and that's what we want to talk about now. I want to make a couple distinctions. Actually, Churchland makes even more distinctions. I just want you to get this one basic distinction between two kinds of dualism. So there's substance dualism and there's property dualism. Substance dualism says that each mind is a distinct non-physical thing. Property dualism says that you've got a physical brain. There isn't non-physical thing that you have along with your brain, but your physical brain has non-physical properties, qualities. That's a little bit hard to get your head around. Let me back up. So the substance dualism says that the mind is a distinct non-physical thing. It's not your brain. It's an individual package of non-physical substance. Its identity is independent of any physical body to which it may be temporarily attached. Property dualism says, no, there's not like a thing that's floating alongside your brain or in close connection with it. It's just your brain. But your brain has certain non-physical properties. For example, when you have a thought or a desire or a sensation, that's your brain doing that stuff. It's a property of your brain. But those mental properties can't ever actually be reduced to the features of physical matter. There is no, brain state or brain chemistry that is your thought. I can't dissect your brain and say, hey, there's that thought. No, you've got a physical brain, but it's got non-physical properties like sensations or thoughts or desires. Your desires aren't identical to any little chunk of your brain. Okay, so property dualism is kind of a more recent phenomenon. Substance dualism is a bit easier to understand. There's a non-physical thing, and I think it's fair to say that it's the older view. But we'll see what there is in favor of each of them. Now, why do we care about dualism? Why do we care about materialism? Why do we care about the nature of the mind? Well, there's a lot of reasons why this is an important and interesting question. We want to know what kind of beings we are. What kind of thing is it that's doing this thinking? That's an interesting, important question in its own right. But one reason that the question of dualism is important is because of its connection to the possibility of an afterlife. So after your body dies, you keep on existing. Many religious people have said so. They've said there's an afterlife, and it's variously described in different religions. It doesn't matter, and you don't have to even be religious to believe in an afterlife. But let me talk a little bit here and clarify the relationship between dualism and the possibility of an afterlife, right? It seems like you've got to be some kind of substance dualist if the afterlife is real, right? Because if your body dies, there's no part of you that could go to an afterlife unless you have some kind of non-physical mind or soul. Right? Your brain is going to rot in the ground. How can you, if your brain is all that there is to your mind, and your mind can't survive after your brain is dead and rotten in the ground. There couldn't be an afterlife, in other words, unless you had some kind of non-physical mind or soul. So substance dualism seems to be necessary for the possibility of an afterlife. However, just because let's say that dualism is true. Let's say that substance dualism is the case. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is an afterlife, right? Maybe you have a non-physical soul, but it dies when your body dies. Maybe this non-physical soul somehow accompanies your brain all through its physical life. When that brain dies, non-physical soul dies too. And it doesn't go to an afterlife. That's also possible. So Socrates seems to have been, he was definitely a dualist. He seems to have been agnostic about whether there was an afterlife. He thinks very possibly, maybe, hopefully, probably. But sometimes he's not entirely sure whether there is an afterlife. The point is, he thought, look, in order for me to be a thinking creature at all, bodies can't think. I've got to have a non-physical substance, a non-physical soul that's doing the thinking. So dualism is definitely true. But he didn't know whether or not that soul would outlive his body. In other words, substance dualism is necessary but not sufficient for the reality of an afterlife. Okay, but if the materialists are correct and dualism is not true, it seems like there can't be an afterlife. That's not even a possibility. All right, so that's a little bit about what's one aspect of what's at stake in this discussion. Now, today I want to talk about 4 arguments for dualism. I'm sorry, 4 arguments against dualism. And these are drawn from Churchland in his reading. I think he gives you even more arguments. I tried to narrow it down to the 4 that I thought were most powerful or important. So we got the argument from simplicity, and the other names are long. The argument from the relative explanatory impotence of dualism, the argument from the neural dependence of all known mental phenomena, and the argument from evolutionary history. Let's take these up one by one. First of all, the argument from simplicity. Premise 1. If all else is equal, then the simpler of 2 competing hypotheses should be preferred. That's the one that's most likely to be true. Now, let me explain that premise for a second. If any of you have ever heard the term Occam's razor, that's what's going on here. The idea is that you should prefer the simplest scientific hypothesis. That's the one that's more likely to be true. But for example, if you drop your, if I drop a marker in class and it falls to the ground, here's 2 possible explanations of what's going on. One hypothesis, the force of gravity pulled it down to the center of the earth. Second hypothesis, there's an invisible elf that always carries the marker from my hand and takes it down to his home at the ground. Now, let's say that those 2 hypotheses, we didn't have any other evidence, right, about gravity. Let's say I didn't know about Newton, I hadn't been to physics class, and those both seemed like they're totally equal. I don't know which one to prefer. They both seem like they've got a lot going for them. Totally possible. Let's say if I thought that. Well, this principle says, yeah, but which one's simpler? Let's assume that there's equal evidence for the elf theory and for the gravity theory. Pick the one that's simpler. And what's simpler, really? Gravity or positing invisible creatures who have homes in the ground and so forth? That's not simple. Gravity's simpler, so stick with gravity. That's the best hypothesis. That's what premise 1 is saying. Pick the simple hypothesis if you're torn between 2 and they both seem like they're equally plausible. So let's say that you're in a position where you think, I don't know which hypothesis about the mind is better. You know, materialism seems plausible and so does dualism. They seem like they're equal in all of respects. Well, the materialist says materialism is a simpler hypothesis than dualism. Now, why is it a simpler hypothesis? Because it only invokes one substance, one kind of thing, matter, physical matter, which everyone is immediately familiar with through their senses. Dualism is not simple because it invokes 2 substances, and 2 is more complicated than 1. And furthermore, the second kind of substance that dualism invokes is one that we can't see through our senses. It's kind of mystical. So materialism is just a simpler hypothesis than dualism. If you think that both of them have the same amount of evidence supporting them, pick the simpler one. That's materialism. That's more likely to be true. Now, what's a possible objection to this argument? Well, here's one possible objection that the dualist might bring up. Maybe the dualist would say, look, I agree with premise 1. I agree that if all else is equal, you should take the simplest hypothesis. But actually, all else is not equal. Dualism can explain a lot of things about the mind that materialism can't explain. So they might object to premise 2. That's one possibility. Or you might just reject Occam's razor if you reject premise 1. But again, if the dualist wants to say that all else is not equal and that dualism can explain phenomena that materialism can't, they're going to have to show us the money. Like, what can dualism explain that materialism can't explain? What is it? Show us the money. Let's come back to that. Argument number 2. The argument from the relative explanatory impotence of dualism. Premise 1. We can explain a lot about the mind's capacities just in terms of material substances and properties. Now, what do I mean? Well, think about what neuroscientists can do. Just by talking about the brain and what's going on inside your brain and brain anatomy, the synapses, the electrical impulses that are sent between different parts of your brain and the chemistry, just by talking about the physical aspects of what the brain can do, we can explain so much about how people think and the feelings that they have and why they make the choices they have and the desires they have. We can explain so much about human thinking and cognition just by talking about the physical brain. That's a lot of explanatory power. However, premise two, we cannot explain much about the mind's capacities in terms of non-physical substances and properties. So let's say you got a dualist who believes that there's a non-physical mind or soul. Well, what's the equivalent of a neurophysiologist for dualism? Like a soulologist, a mindologist? Can you get a PhD in figuring out how the non-physical soul works and makes us do all this thinking? Well, the material says no. There is no equivalent to neurophysiology. These dualists, even if they believe in a mind that's not physical, they can't explain much about the mechanics of how it works and how it makes us think and do all this mental stuff. They can't explain it. They just say, well, there's a soul and it does stuff. They don't tell us how it works. Therefore, materialism is a better explanation of mental phenomena, that is, of how the mind works, how it does all this stuff. Materialism is a better explanation than dualism. Premise four, the best explanation of phenomena is the most likely to be the true one. Therefore, materialism is more likely to be true than dualism. Now, what could a dualist reply to this? Well, look, you might say, premise one, let's go back to premise one for a second. Premise one said that we can explain a lot about the mind just in terms of physical functioning of the brain. The dualist might want to say, yeah, of course that's true. Dualism doesn't deny that the physical brain plays a crucial role in affecting how the mind works. It just says that the physical brain is all that there is. Absolutely. The physical brain causes the non-physical mind to do all kinds of stuff all the time. A dualist might say they're interacting all the time. The mind, the non-physical mind, and the brain are constantly interacting. And so, of course, it makes a lot of sense that every time you have this kind of brain state, you're having this kind of thought. And every time you're having this kind of desire, you're having this kind of brain state. Sure, that's totally consistent with dualism. It doesn't count against dualism. A dualist would expect premise one to be true. However, they want to say it's false. Premise two is false. Premise two said, well, you can't really explain much of anything in terms of dualism. And again, the dualist might want to say, wait, that's not true. There are things about our mental life, about cognition, that dualism can explain a lot better than materialism, that materialism can't explain at all. So they want to say, yes, the brain is absolutely necessary to explaining our mental life, but it's not sufficient. So they could agree with premise one, but they want to deny premise two. Third argument, the argument from the neural dependence of all known mental phenomena. So the word neural means having to do with the brain. Here's how this argument goes. If substance dualism is true, then reason, emotion, and consciousness are relatively invulnerable to direct control or pathology by manipulation or damage to the brain. Pause, let me unpack that. So if substance dualism is true, that means that there's the physical brain and there's a non-physical mind. The non-physical mind is what's doing all the, that's where reason, emotion, and consciousness are. Now, if substance dualism is true, then this premise says you should be able to hit somebody on the head and wreck their brain. That shouldn't have any impact on their reasoning or their emotion or their consciousness, because that's all in the non-physical mind. So you should be able to like smash somebody's brain and yet their mind to be totally still intact. But of course, premise 2 says reason, emotion, and consciousness are very vulnerable to direct control or pathology by manipulating damage to the brain. When you hit somebody on the head with a brick, they can't think anymore. They don't have emotions anymore. They lose consciousness, right? So that the conclusion is substance dualism must be false. Substance dualism predicts that when you hit somebody on the head with a brick, they keep on thinking just like they did before. Obviously, that's false. So substance dualism is false. How's a dualist going to respond to this? Well, a dualist wants to say, wait a minute, premise 1 is not true. Substance dualism doesn't imply that reason and emotion and consciousness are invulnerable to brain damage. Substance dualism might very well say that the mind and the brain are constantly interacting. In fact, the mind can't do its thing well unless the brain is healthy. It doesn't mean they're the same thing, just that they're deeply interconnected. And so possibly every change in a brain state is correlated with or even caused by a change in the soul. What that would mean was if you knock out the brain, the mind can't do its thing. Not because they're identical with each other, but because they're interdependent. So the dualist is going to want to deny premise 1. Very possibly. All right. We have one more argument here. The argument from evolutionary history. Premise 1. If naturalistic evolution is the correct account of our origins, then substance dualism is neither a necessary nor a possible hypothesis. Let me explain my terms. When I say naturalistic, I mean something is naturalistic if it only involves physical, material, natural processes. It doesn't involve anything supernatural. Now, so Darwinian evolution is a process that describes, it's an account of the origins of the species, right? It involves random mutations of our genes, and then this is the neo-Darwinian, if you factor in the genes and all that stuff. Random mutations of our genes, some of those give the organism a reproductive advantage. There's natural selection that happens, and then the survival of the fittest. What that leads to is, the production of all living things. Now, some people say are evolutionists, but they're not naturalistic evolutionists. They might be theistic evolutionists. So a theistic evolutionist is someone who thinks, well, evolution is how all the species came about, but God was in control, or some mind was in control of mutations were happening and how the selection process happened. So that would be like supernaturalistic evolution. But this premise is about naturalistic evolution. If there is no mind or God involved in the evolutionary process, and that's how we came about, then substance dualism is neither a necessary nor possible hypothesis. Now, why would anyone think this? Because a naturalistic process is one that only involves natural items, physical, material substances, and ordinary physical processes. If you start out with physical materials, and just like ordinary natural processes working on physical materials, the end product is not going to be some non-physical thing. It's just going to be a reconfigured physical organism. So if we came from naturalistic evolution, and no like soul kind of thing could ever pop out of that process, only physical organisms, purely physical organisms, are going to pop out of that process. That's the idea of premise one. But, says Churchland, obviously, naturalistic evolution is the correct account of our origins. 3. Therefore, substance dualism is neither a necessary nor a possible hypothesis. Now, how might a dualist respond to this? Well, some of them are going to deny premise 2. They're going to deny that naturalistic evolution is the correct account of our origins. Now, you may think that I have in mind here religious creationists. So we live in Greenville, South Carolina. You may be familiar with this kind of denial of evolution, the position that says, look, Genesis is right. In the beginning, the world, God created humans and all the different species of animals. They didn't come from any evolutionary process at all. They were specially created from the dirt, and that's it. There was no evolution involved with it. And you don't even necessarily have to be a Christian to believe that. You might be, you might hold any number of kind of religious positions and think, no, life did not come from evolutionary processes, just emerged all at once. Okay, so and that's one possible denial of premise 2. But you might also, you might be someone who denies naturalistic evolution, but not from a religious perspective. So let me give you an example. A philosopher, Thomas Nagel, he's an atheist. He says, not only do I not believe in God, I don't even want to believe in God. I don't want the idea. But he doesn't believe in naturalistic evolution. He believes in evolution, but not naturalistic evolution. That only involves physical processes and physical materials. Instead, Nagel believes that non-physical components are kind of built into the universe from the beginning, and there's kind of a cosmic mind which gradually is evolving and coming to consciousness. So as organisms become more complex, their non-physical components are also combining and eventually form minds. So non-physical minds evolve along with physical organisms. It's a unusual position, but the point is, it's a theoretical possibility. So it's not just religious creation. I want to deny premise 2. Now, why would Nagel think this? Why would Nagel be committed to this seemingly strange picture of cosmic evolution? Well, it's precisely because he doesn't think materialism can explain consciousness. He thinks that materialism just totally fails to explain how consciousness could ever come about. So therefore, naturalistic evolution must just be false as the correct of our origin, as an account of our origins. All right, so here's some things to think about after all of that. Those are dense arguments. Which of those do you think is the strongest argument against dualism? And what do you think is the best reply to that argument? Do you think these arguments work, or do you think dualism is definitively defeated by one or more of these arguments? That's the question to wrestle with for today.